I'm going to wait a few moments before we go ahead and get started. I'm so thrilled to have everybody here this afternoon. We will be discussing on teleeducation, and this is how you sign it, which is distance learning. I'd like to go ahead and give a visual description before I continue. I am a female. I'm biracial. I have brown skin. I have long dark hair. I'm wearing a maroon shirt with a black background, and I have the TDI logo here at the corner of my screen. So today we have 3 panelists that will be joining us today, and I will go ahead and share their names and give them the opportunity to introduce themselves. This topic again is covering on teleeducation, but this does not just apply to a classroom environment. This includes a workplace, maintaining certification, and so forth. The 3 people that will be joining us today, we will have Sheryl, Raj, and Sheryl. If you can go ahead and put yourselves on the screen and introduce yourselves, we'll go ahead and start with Sheryl.
Well, hello. I'm Sheryl Burgstahler. I go by she and her, and I teach online. So I have years of experience and actually teaching students with a wide variety of disabilities, because my presentations are often about universal design or accessible design. I deliver a lot of conference presentations, and I do my best to make them accessible to people with disabilities and to people from the deaf and hard of hearing community. I direct the Do It Center at the University of Washington, where Do It stands for Disabilities, Opportunity, Technology. It's been around since 1992. But I also direct the IT accessibility team, where we're responsible for making sure that the technology that we provide on our campus to our faculty, students, and visitors, and the staff, is fully accessible to anyone that might want to use them on campus or off.
Great, thank you. I'd like to go ahead and turn it over to Raja. Hi there, my name is Raja Kushalnagar. I often like to share with the audience, I don't care how my name is pronounced, I just care about the spelling, because in the English language, because English is my first written language, but not spoken. Also, I'd like to share I am a male. I go by the pronouns he and him. In sign language, there are no pronouns. It's just a pointing gesture. I am a director of a technical program at Gallaudet University. I work on providing accessibilities and resources, accessing both communication and information. I work a lot with Dr. Vicker at Gallaudet. I also teach several courses. It's normally I do it in person, but due to the pandemic, this last year it's been virtual. And there have been a lot of issues in regards to the internet world and the issues that come about, such as video. And I will explain a little bit more about that later in this presentation. And I'd like to turn it over to the next person. This is great, and I will go ahead and turn it over to Chris. Now, before Chris shows on screen, I'd like for the 2 of you to stay.
Hello. Hi, my name is Chris Sun. I'm a male. I have strawberry blonde hair and a reddish gray beard. I'm wearing a maroon colored shirt and I have glasses on. I'm sitting in front of a gray background. So I'm a software engineer at Microsoft. I'm currently working as a tech lead for Microsoft Teams. And I was involved in bringing Teams to the Surface Hub. I did some work on Teams iOS app. And I'm currently working on the latest version of Teams that is shipping with Windows 11. In previous roles at Microsoft, I have worked on Skype for Business on the Surface Hub, Office for Mac, and Visual Studio. I'm extremely passionate about driving an accessibility first mindset in product development with the goal of ensuring that products like Teams provide an equitable experience for everyone. So I'm really excited to be here today and I look forward to the discussions.
Great. And we will go ahead and start with our first question. The first question I have for you all. Wow, what a year it's been. We have gone through so much. There have been a lot of challenges that's taken place at different levels. I'd like to take the opportunity to ask you all if you can share an experience or a situation where teleworking, whether as an educator or hybrid, you found that it was not accessible. Could you share those experiences with us? And this is open to anybody whoever would like to start.
I'll go ahead and start. This is Chris. So I'll start by saying that remote work experience has been far more accessible for me than in person. To me, it's not necessarily about technology or the limitations of technology, but my ability to access and process multiple asynchronous information streams. So as an engineer who works in an open space where collaboration is the norm and it's very much encouraged, the positioning of interpreters throughout the many discussions that are happening throughout the day makes it extremely difficult to follow what's going on. And this is especially problematic in situations where I must watch the interpreter while simultaneously being able to follow what someone is doing on their screen. So by the time I'm able to move my eyes off the interpreter and onto the screen, I'm always a few steps behind the person who's talking. So now with remote working, I use interpreters, no captions. I have 2 interpreters, one who is actively interpreting voice to sign, and the other who is ready to voice for me when needed. And they switch roles every 15 minutes. So we use 2 apps. Obviously, we're using Teams, but we also use Skype. We connect to each other, just the 3 of us through Skype, and then we call into the meeting on Teams. And there's several reasons for using Skype. When the Skype app is running in the background, the primary speaker window is always on the top. So this allows me to position the current interpreter wherever I need them to be. So for example, if I'm in a coding session with someone, I can put the interpreter close to the code that we're looking at. And then this reduces all the eye head movement that occurs in person when I'm switching between a screen and the interpreter, and it allows me to follow things a lot closer. That primary speaker window also allows me to multitask during the meetings because everyone else is checking emails, right? Reading documents, writing code, or even checking the weather during the meeting. So why shouldn't I be able to do the same? But Teams, unfortunately, doesn't allow me to do this. When you switch focus away from Teams, it's in the background. So having Skype is really helpful in that regard. One of the benefits of using Skype in addition to Teams is that it allows my interpreters to be invisible in the entire process. So long story short, the project I was working on at the beginning of the pandemic was canceled and I was moved to a different team. Now, I've been working at Microsoft for a very long time and I've been on several different teams, worked with a lot of different people, but this transition was the smoothest that I've ever experienced. When I meet people for the first time online, I explain that I'm on a call with my interpreters. They acknowledge it. They might ask a few questions about how they can best accommodate, and then we move on. And it's very different than the dynamic in person, especially with smaller, even one-on-one meetings, because they're not trying to get over the fact that instead of a one-on-one meeting, it's 1-on-3. And people also tend to get distracted by the signing. So it's nice to not have that be an issue. Another benefit of having a second app is in the situation where bandwidth becomes an issue. I can control the video. Teams, unfortunately, doesn't allow me to do the individual video control. So it means if I am using Teams, it's not possible for me to turn off all the videos except for the interpreter. It's all or nothing. So I typically just turn off incoming video on Teams, and then I have video on for Skype, and it's not impacted by the bandwidth issue. I found myself in some situations where I've been completely killed off Teams, but because my interpreters are still in the meeting, I'm able to follow everything. So there are obviously some disadvantages. The biggest one is when I speak during meetings, the speaker indicator on Teams shows that it's the interpreter speaking instead of me. I find this to be very disempowering. I want people to know that I'm speaking, and I want to be represented in meetings as such. This is also problematic when it comes to captioning, especially transcripts, because instead of what I'm saying being attributed to me, it's once again attributed to the interpreter who is speaking. And then add that I have two different interpreters who speak for me, and it can get very confusing very quickly. Overall, despite the disadvantages, the remote working experience has been overwhelmingly positive for me. I realize that's not the case for everyone, but personally, for the most part, I've been able to overcome the shortcomings. This obviously doesn't mean that there isn't room for improvement.
This is Raja here. Now, as far as accessibility in a work environment, with teleeducation, and of course, again, in a work environment, it is at a different perspective. With smaller groups, it's great. It's more focused. The information is up close. There is an automatic connection with the interpreter and the language. You're able to see it together, which is very nice. However, as it becomes much more vast, and as we're starting to use more Zoom and platforms such like Zoom, it ends up breaking down. Sometimes there's technical difficulties trying to figure out who is speaking. And with Zoom, it's hard to identify who's the speaker, who's the presenter, having to rely on chat, which can cause confusion. Even with the controls by management, there is only one person that's assigned that role. So it just depends. Now we're developing a standard process for providing control, such as spotlighting one person, or using the feature to raise your hand. And as well as having more control on how many windows are on the screen. But the challenges that do come about are the captions and the transcript. And often it's a better solution to have to separate the two on two different devices. So if you're using the development for UI with an interpreter and Zoom, the transcript is great, or it might switch back and forth. Sometimes the accommodations are not perfect in the system. Another challenge that does arise are with videos. There is not enough webinar, and it ends up being blurry or choppy. So it's really hard sometimes. That causes an issue. We have to think about how to work around it. But again, when it's a small intimate group, it's much easier. And with teleeducation, we are having to rely on communication and internet. The other challenge is the social aspect of it, when the video platform shuts off. Or if there are people speaking over one another and having to interrupt or trying not to interrupt. Now with Zoom, there is not that social aspect that we're used to. And that impacts education. Often education relies heavily on socialization and the support outside of the academic teaching or instruction, excuse me. So that's the main thing that I could mention about this. This is May. Sheryl, if you'd like to share something in regards to any challenges you've seen.
Sure, I'll speak from the perspective of an online instructor. And one of the challenges is there's so many videos out there that are not captioned. And even those that are captioned by a computer and not edited. And so we spend a time in both of my roles kind of helping people learn how they can go in and caption or edit their captions on YouTube and on other platforms to make them more accurate. But also encouraging people, particularly when they are creating a little maybe introduction video in my classes, that they make sure to caption that video and really impress upon other faculty, and that it's you should have all your videos perfectly captioned, but it is kept because at least students have a chance to get the accommodations they need and have things captioned in time to stay up with their class. But it's not very welcoming. The very first thing you encounter, this little video, is not captioning. I mean, it's kind of a strong statement that we didn't invite you or we didn't expect you to come. And so that's a really important thing that we keep pushing on. Within our IT accessibility team, we actually try to put pressure on our department around the University of Washington. It's a pretty big place. And so there are a lot of channels on YouTube, for instance, that have videos from various departments. And so we actually have an algorithm where we can check whether those captions have been edited or presented new captions besides just the computer generated ones. And we share this information with those people that are in charge of these channels, and in a very positive way, by the way. But it's like, hey, only 60% of ours are captioned now. How can we got to get the rest of them done? Because they want to get to 100% without our prompting. So sometimes peer support can help. Another thing that we do through our IT accessibility team is we provide a pool of money, a small pool of money, where we can do free captioning for units on campus for what we call high impact videos, those that are likely to be seen by a lot of people, that maybe if in large classes that are reused over and over, and maybe on some of our high level websites. We don't rely on that pool, by the way, for accommodations requested by students who request captions, because that retroactive sort of approach is already built into our accommodation office. And so this way, we encourage people by, hey, we'll caption your videos, we'll do it ourselves, or we'll pay for our consultant to do it. And they think, wow, kind of a free gift. But part of the deal is they have to work with us. They have to agree to work with us to learn how to caption, and hopefully make a commitment that they will caption their videos in the future. And so that's been very successful as well. I will say that computer generated captions are certainly getting a lot better. We're certainly not done, and we'll never reach a point where computer generated captions are equivalent to human beings actually doing captioning, but they're getting close, particularly in talking head sort of situations. Another thing that can be a frustration in my role as IT accessibility team coordinator is faculty that don't really think they need to caption things and don't kind of get it for presentations and so forth. And this extends to conferences. I've been going to a lot of online conferences because I can, but also to spread the word about accessibility in a number of different ways. And so many of these conferencing programs that are being used are not fully accessible, and they're not designed to be offering accessible content to everyone. And in the case of captioning, some don't support captioning. And one that I gave not too long ago, a few weeks ago, I had to include the captioning feature within PowerPoint, for example, in order to get captions. Now, I can do that, but I thought it was unfortunate that conference wouldn't take ownership of the captioning experience, because how many other presenters would do that? I don't think very many. I didn't see any others that were captioning their videos. And so that's kind of a frustration all along the kind of in the dimension of providing interpreters and captioners for videos. By the way, in my course that I'm teaching right now, I do mainly asynchronous methods. And if I have something synchronous, I always make sure that it is captioned and posted for people to look back later that benefit everyone, particularly if they have captions on them. So those are a couple of things.
Sheryl brought up one interesting point about in education. Many people just don't understand ASR and the quality of ASR. It really does impact the student. We need to understand that. Going back to what Sheryl was also saying about universal design, I think that's critical, a critical term that really needs to be out in the community, to design from the beginning with accessibility in mind. Even when the design is happening from the beginning and making sure it's accessible, making sure that it's equivalent or accessible and acceptable. So that is a question for you all. What do you think about that? Access, full access, what does that look like? How do we design that from the beginning? Anyone have an answer there? Raja? This is Raja. Yeah, accessibility is for everyone and not just for information or communication, but everything in between. So often people think in the school system, accessibility to the academic information is the only thing that people need. And everything outside of class, the social aspect of it, isn't necessarily needed to be need accessibility there. But Zoom is cool because it does provide that socialization access and maybe providing an interpreter there. Another thing also is automatic speech recognition. It's not perfect.
Mhm.
It works with simple vocabulary. If you have great audio, a minimal accent, no background noise, but oftentimes communication breaks down because you have poor audio, accents from the speaker, and nobody to fix that or to interrupt that. There's no human in that system to fix those errors. And also with interpreters, no interpreters involved. I think ASR is great. It's nice. It's a great solution, but it's a support rather than a replacement. Yeah. May here, yeah, from the educator's perspective, they don't understand the difference in what the quality looks like. Okay, who wants to address this?
I want to say one more. Can I say one more word about that?
Oh, sure.
Is how can we promote this? Sometimes I get I see that faculty understand what I'm talking about when I talk about the value of captions for English language learners, and tell them, it's kind of a mean trick when you take someone who's learning English and you give them incorrectly spelled words and no punctuation. Isn't that kind of a mean trick when you think about it? They're trying to learn English. You are teaching them through that caption. And it's not that they don't recognize the value to students who are deaf as well, but some of them have more students in their class who are English language learners and kind of get that. And so I do promote captioning, not just as something for a small minority of the population. And then also a video on chemistry or something. It's bound to have some really long words in it. And again, we want all of our students to be able to see how things are spelled.
Chris, I think Chris wanted to say something. Go ahead, Chris.
I did. Thanks. Yeah, I think it's a really tricky question because we are so multi-layered individuals and comprised of various backgrounds, experiences, identities, and so many other aspects. So our definition of what is accessible is going to be different for each person. It's not a one size fits all. And that's what makes the space so challenging, right? I don't know if there is a clear answer for how we can make products fully accessible, but there are things that we can do to work towards that goal. For me, that accessibility first mindset is a big part of driving that change. And when we're designing products, especially on the feature level, we need to be thinking about how we're going to build an equitable experience. The disability spectrum is so broad, and it can be hard to think about all the different possibilities. If someone doesn't recognize a potential problem because it doesn't impact them personally, then they're not going to have a satisfactory solution or any solution at all for it. When you're forced to continually adapt to an environment that isn't designed for you, you're going to naturally try to produce solutions that will attempt to improve things. And in most cases, those solutions end up benefiting a larger number of people than the targeted group. The very first closed captions, for example, were developed by a deaf person. They were created for the deaf and hard of hearing community, yet they are used today as a tool for those learning how to read, learning to speak a non-native language, or an environment even where the user may be temporarily disabled, such as a high noise environment, or maybe an environment where they need sound to be at a minimum because they're trying not to wake up a sleeping baby. So I think it starts with an accessibility first mindset and in making sure that products are designed by and with people with disabilities.
Absolutely. Raj, before I turn it over to you, I do have a comment in regards to what Chris was talking about and what Carrie Lou was talking about. It's not just one person, it's not the deaf community or one office, it's actually system-wide change that needs to happen. Like Raja said. Two, we can't just put it on one person, it's everyone. It's everyone. So Raja, go
Exactly.
ahead. Raja here, to that point, a system-wide change. What's cool about ASR is with its limitations, with both hearing and deaf people watching captions together, they're recognizing where communication gaps are happening. And sometimes, if you're in a one-on-one situation, you realize it's not working out. And now with captioning and accessibility there, I just found Netflix. 40% of all the consumers use captioning pretty frequently. That's a large percentage. And also in other countries, statistically, the US and the UK are up to 20% of all TV watchers who are using captioning. So for many different reasons, all of us can say what those reasons might be, but accessibility becomes universal, which is nice. So one issue as accessibility to captions happens, it does vary in some ways. It's not a lot, it is a lot more varied than we know. There's a big curve there. There's the largest number under the peak statistically. So a solution for the outer parts of the tail statistically are the outliers, right? So we need to think about them and design for them. So that's what I have to say about captioning. Hey here, what I want to talk about with Roger, what he just said, thinking about accessibility and designing it for the environments, and not only for different environments, but small groups might work, something might work well, but might not work well for a larger group. You do have to think about accessibility for everyone and not just in one environment. You have to think about those various environments and what the impact would be in that environment and what that looks like. So you're right, Raja. Yeah. So Chris, I'm curious, you talked about your experience using different platforms at the same time to make your work environment accessible. Sheryl, Raja, maybe you can add, but the platforms you're using, how is that designed to be accessible with keeping accessibility in mind for those platforms in a professional or educational environment? What does that look like?
Yeah, so for those of you who don't know, education is one of several different verticals in Microsoft Teams. And at its core, it's the same code base, but it's been modified to adapt to the virtual classroom experience with an emphasis, of course, on the classroom collaboration. The feature that is most relevant to this discussion is the same across all the different verticals, and that's the meeting experience. So in terms of accessibility for the deaf and hard of hearing community, live captions is currently the only feature that's available. We do have the hand raising feature, which brings more attention to those who wish to speak up during meetings. And we're currently working on providing CART support that will allow meeting organizers and participants to request that their captioning service provider streams captions to Teams. But at the end of the day, while it's great that platforms like Teams are providing tools that help with accessibility, it is ultimately up to the meeting organizer to make sure that their content is accessible. They own the content and they should make it accessible.
Thank you for that, Chris. Sheryl?
Yeah, I'd like to add to that. One of the things in helping these companies make their products more accessible is it's an ongoing effort through their IT accessibility team. It's not just a do it and you're done effort. It's like the two best examples I have lately are Canvas and Zoom. In both cases, my IT accessibility team evaluated a number of products and they did not vote for those two products, by the way. For our campus to adopt. And once the University of Washington adopts some piece of technology, you can be pretty sure that all the other post-secondary institutions will follow. And so we have put a lot of pressure on ourselves to do a good job. So my team said, these products are not very accessible, but the group decided that they wanted to purchase those products or license those products. And so once that happens, then my team continues to work quickly. But the most immediate thing we do is to get in the contract itself before it's signed a statement that the company agrees to that they will work with our IT accessibility team, my team, and continually to evaluate and improve the accessibility of their software. And sometimes they'll tweak that wording and stuff, but just getting something in the contract that says they'll connect with us. And they usually welcome this eventually, not at first sometimes. But in both cases with those two products, there are other campuses that have standardized on those or are using those or are thinking about it. And so we bring them together in our team. For instance, in the Canvas case, we have a Canvas class set up where over 100 IT support personnel at post-secondary schools of all sizes engage in discussing computer accessibility issues. And we like to call those bugs, since we know what a bug is. It's a mistake, it's an error, it needs to be fixed rather than it's just a little special thing you have an add-on later on, which is the way some people think about accessibility. And so they regularly will report these bugs and they will prioritize. And there are several people in that room that are from Instructional, which is the company that produces Canvas. And they're very supportive and they love to point to our group when they're selling their product to other schools. But the key there is that you're only one version away from being inaccessible, no matter how accessible the product is that you selected. Because we know these companies are updating their software, it seems like almost weekly, and you can't let go. You have to keep testing and make sure that they're reminded if they break things, which they tend to do quite often, that they break things, and often that's the accessibility features because they're not testing for those as much as they might be testing for other things. And so I think it's critical that we get these communities together. You can imagine Instructional paying a lot more attention to 100 people in that class or course framework than it would be just the University of Washington talking to them, where often they might say, well, nobody else is complaining about this.
This is Sheryl. That's a great mention of the university and a corporation and how they work side by side. And I think that's going to be great for the future. Now, with that type of research and with the experience, now, are you planning to release that to the public? Is that going to be published? Or do you know of some place where they can share that type of information and share the value of the research and what's worked and what has not? And to be able to sponsor and really advocate for the change in accessibility for those products.
Sometimes we'll do a little research study or whatever, but we never identify the web pages we're evaluating or whatever, but we might be reporting the value of training or whatever. One of the unfortunate things about accessibility testing is the attorneys that represent our post-secondary schools get very nervous about sharing those results. And I actually do as an administrator as well, because if we, for instance, let's take Zoom or Canvas, if we reported today what the accessibility problems they have right this minute, we have a great relationship with them. They're working on it. It's on their task list, and it may be fixed next week. And so we are now sharing information that's not true anymore. And so it's such a moving target that most post-secondary institutions will not agree to do that. And so there's a lot of retrofitting and reinventing the wheel. That's why I think these communities, kind of a community of practice idea, where there can be a lively conversation, but you're not like publishing it on a website somewhere, have a lot of value.
I understand that. And I think this is my here. I think that's great to share that information. That's understood. Raja, if you'd like to speak on that. Raja here, that's right. With softwares changing accessibility over time, there's an example, and sometime in the past, Zoom used to have a phone number to be able to be called in, and you can use a VRI, a video relay interpreter, and have the interpreter in the meeting. And I think at some point it stopped, and that there was no way to access that. And the interpreter was unable to participate in the meeting through using video relay interpreters. There were several complaints, and about 2-3 months later, they eventually added that option. And that goes the same with automatic captions, having to be on a paid plan, but it was not included in the free plan. And so that became an equity issue. Having to pay for accessibility, I mean, does that sound right? Is that a good approach? I don't know if it's a really good idea. So, most would know that, but of course there are a lot of platforms that have their own challenges. So we'd like to experiment with other platforms as well, and getting created with UI design and working collectively. And I wish that we could include the deaf perspective and include those ideas that are really cool, but because of the accessibility fully not put in place, then I don't see it happening. So there are challenges that we're having to really move forth with, and figuring out the new options that would provide the accessibility at the same time. This is my here. I do agree with that with both Sheryl and Raja. It's important to have a statement, the perspective of the deaf community, to have their input. And it's important to be able to see what the future looks like. Would it be more of a hybrid approach, or what needs to change? What kind of changes do we need to see? So I'm curious, what are your thoughts? Sheryl.
I wanted to pick up on one thing that Raja was saying, and that is, I think it was Raja, or maybe it was my, anyway, that they charge extra. Some conferencing software and other software will charge extra for accessibility features. It is like, I cannot believe it. And someone asked me, well, is that illegal? Well, I'm not an attorney, but it's not my understanding that it's illegal to create inaccessible products or to charge for whatever in your product. But what it is, it does violate at least the spirit of the Americans with Disabilities Act, to be using inaccessible products. And so we should, at least if we want to use a product that you have to pay extra for accessibility, which I really don't like that idea, but we should buy it.
Understood, Raja here. That's understood. May here. This actually is in regards to my next question. So I might shift for a little bit. So I'm going to hold that. But for the next question, who's responsible in providing accommodations and providing the accessibility? Is the school responsible? is the tech company responsible, and the costs that are involved? What does that look like? And those accommodations, do you have any thoughts on that you'd like to share? Raja here. Also from a legal standpoint, in general, it just depends on the legal rules and that it's managed. It's for better or for worse. There are a lot of different ways that have barriers in place for education, such as K through 12, IDEA in a workplace with ADA, and also there are some states that have different regulations as well. So it's pretty complex, but in general, it's pretty easy to follow the ADA organization and what it represents. And the cost for accessibility should be illegal. So, and that's all I have to say. May here, Sheryl, go ahead.
In most cases, it's whoever's offering the service. So if you're offering an online course, a university or some private organization or whatever, that organization are responsible. Sometimes in a post-secondary institution, people say, well, that department is responsible, not us. The university is responsible, period. That's where you're going to have to reach compliance. You can delegate some responsibilities to different units on campus, but it doesn't relieve your responsibility. Kind of think of it back in the day when people were arguing whether in an on-site conference, if it's not fully accessible to wheelchair users, whose fault is that? And people used to come to me, not so much now, and say, well, it's not our fault. It's the hotel, right? Well, no, it's your fault because you are the one that contracted with that hotel. And so you have to take ownership of what you purchased or what you've agreed to use.
This is May here. That's a very interesting point that you've made, Sheryl. And previously you had just mentioned about university assessing their products that are being used. And so this really is accountability, and we really have to assess that situation and make sure that it's met the students' needs, which is very interesting. Raja, I see you have your hand up. This is Raja. In regards to that, there's a concept, it's the center budget, and it's at a high potential level, at a universal level. And you don't bring it down to a department level or research. I have personally experienced that as well, and it's very challenging. At a lower level stance, there's a lot of barriers because of budget, providing for interviews and all that entails. And there's a lot of unfortunate cases that take place because the budget does not support that. And it impacts those that are involved. And there are some things that are found absent in the legal realm, both theoretically and practice that is applied. So it's a really hard part about that. This is my hair. So with that, I'd like to go ahead and share my next question. So with the future of education, with instruction, what does that look like? Are we projecting that it might be more hybrid, in person? What kind of challenges would take place? What do you foresee? I can see that everyone's sitting and thinking about that. Raja, go ahead. This is Raja. The hybrid approach and how to instruct both hearing and deaf, whether it's face-to-face or online, can sometimes, well, nowadays, the software doesn't have the quality to provide that service, but it's not due for most classes, excuse me, and there isn't a solution. At Gallaudet, it's forced to either do face-to-face instruction or virtual, but we haven't done both. We know that that there's a software that provides the hybrid education. Okay, this is my here. Sheryl or Chris, do either one of you have something to add to that?
I think there are two
Sheryl?
ways people are using the hybrid terminology. One is, and I think what Raja is referring to is you offer a course like fully online and fully on site kind of at the same time. So people can be online learners or on-site learners. I'm not sure if that's right, Raja. But anyway, the way I'm using it for what I'm just going to say is just that I've taught fully online, I've taught fully on site, and I've taught hybrid. In that case, you have an on-site class at least part of the time, and you have some online components to it. And I much prefer the hybrid because I think if you organize your course right, you can get the benefits of online learning and of on-site. And often people will talk about discussions and interactions when as being a value in on-site. But when you think about it, if you have a group of 50 students and you're carrying on a conversation with the whole class, not everyone gets to talk. You don't have enough time. And also, if one person answers a question and then another person you call on might add to the answer, you're not really kind of testing them on what they've learned independently. They're piggybacking on what somebody else learned. And yet I love that classroom interaction. I think it's really important, small groups and so forth. But one thing I really like about online conversations, using a typical discussion board offered in any learning management system, you can have a discussion where you pose a question and ask each student to answer it, but they can't see their peers' answers until they post their own. And so then when that happens, what that triggers, they can see all the other responses. And then you can, as an instructor, require, and they look at their peers' reactions or responses to the question, and maybe require them to respond to 2 of those others. When you think about that, everybody in the class has been required to participate actively and to pay attention to the responses of their peers. And the other advantage is if they're an English language learner, or for some reason have difficulty composing their thoughts really quickly, they can take all the time they need in that online discussion. So I have on-site discussions and online every week, and I really love that combination.
This is May here. Great. The best of both worlds, like you said. Anybody else want to add anything? Raja? Raja here. Yes, I do have something to add. That's right. The type of opportunities should be accessibility. The best of both worlds. The social aspect, the face-to-face learning environment, and accessibility online. And, to hide the weakness of each of those. Yeah. So one thing about language access, too, is English accessibility and signing accessibility. So I think when, a video, or you're typing something for a post, or whatever the software is we're using, I think we need to go through the practice of that. May here, Sheryl, what do you think about what he said about doing both approaches and forcing teachers or creating content and pushing those at the university level? What does that look like in different environments for you that will just become part of who you are as a student or an employer? And being mindful of what that looks like at each level. And doing that from the beginning. Again, going back to universal design, designing from accessibility from the beginning. I think that's a great skill set to push them to start thinking about and to teach about. So I have one more question before I wrap it up. In the audience, if you have more questions, please pose them. What about virtual games? That's a hot topic right now. How do you view virtual gaming? How does that impact the education system and how they use virtual world? How do you see that? And virtual gaming itself, is it accessible? And if it's not, there are some challenges we've seen with tele-education in the same ways that applies to virtual gaming in that world. And how that changes in the virtual gaming world, how that might impact the educational realm. Raja? Raja, yeah, gaming. That's nice. It does provide a motivation to accommodate modern or today's generation to make sure that they are inclusive. And if it's to make sure, and they can help with that. And sometimes good design doesn't work. And so the emphasis on gaming is socialization. I think supporting that is great. Also with speech recognition in the gaming realm, that is getting better. But where do you put captioning on that? Or do you add an interpreter? Where would you put them on the screen? So that's the largest challenge we see in a classroom, and when we're trying to use those, and maybe using multiple monitors. We haven't found a solution to these issues yet. So, Sheryl, Chris, do you have anything to say about that question I posed? Sheryl, nothing?
Sure. I direct a project called Access Cyber Learning. Cyber learning being primarily used by the National Science Foundation for any learning opportunities that make use of digital technology. And our project called Access Cyber Learning has been to work with other projects that NSF has funded. And these projects have been to create learning opportunities for students with disabilities, primarily K-12 and many of them gaming. And the one thing I could say about that, and we had several meetings about it with these people and a community of practice, very few of them are considering accessibility of any type, certainly not universal design. And so I find that very frustrating, because that would mean a lot of the games in the future are not going to have accessibility in mind. And so I always promote with these researchers, even if they get a small grant, they might have a $300,000 grant, which is not very big, and they might be piloting something. Well, great, if you're going to pilot a game and you're not going to consider some of these issues we're talking about, like captioning or speech output, or being able to operate it with a keyboard alone and so forth. At least they should identify that as a limitation when they report that research and talk about how it should be considered in future research. But most of them don't even identify that. One meeting that I went to about this was said, well, we can't expect all of these researchers to think about these accessibility issues. And I said, well, in this day and age, I have a feeling you wouldn't fund a project if the proposer said, well, boys like games more than girls, and so we're just going to test this with boys and just leave it at that. It would be silly. We wouldn't do that. We used to do things like that, maybe with textbooks and things back in the day. But anyway, it's frustrating to see that. So we have to continue to push for universal design that includes people who are deaf and hard of hearing, but many other people as well, including English language learners or people with disabilities or whatever, everybody.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, we do need that push from the beginning with the designers. It's a great comment. I do have a question for Sheryl from the audience. Let's see. How do you communicate with hard of hearing students and accommodate them? What accommodations do you have? Assisted listening devices?
Yes, I'd say that would be
How do you sensitize the professor for that? How do you ensure that accountability is there? And that's a big challenge you see at different universities. I'm sorry if I'm throwing so much at you, but yeah.
That's okay.
But that's a question for you, Sheryl.
I am pretty passionate about all this stuff. I want to make clear, I'm not the director of Accessible Technology Services, that unit that provides accommodations, but we work extremely close with them. And I do know they look at each individual student, and the most important thing they consider, besides documentation and so forth, like they have to do, but is what the preference is of the student. So assisted listening devices could be the responsibility of the institution, but many times it's the responsibility of the student to provide as a personal aid. So that's something that they work through. But again, I'm not the one that does that. So that's it.
May here, I just want to make sure that that question that was asked, how do you communicate with students to let them know they have accommodations? How does that work? How do you make sure that the professor knows, oh, they have accommodations that are needed? That's the question.
Oh,
Is
that's,
it
yeah,
the
okay.
students' issue, or is it the professors? Who's in charge there?
Well, if we're talking about higher education, which I'm part of, K-12 education, the counselors and the teachers and the parents have significant roles to play, but not in higher education because we're working with adults. And so it's a responsibility of the student on most campuses to go to the Disability Services Office, which we have to have such a place, or at least a person that they can go to, and show any documentation that about their disability or whatever's required by the institution, and then request an accommodation. And then it's the university's responsibility to provide a reasonable accommodation. So, and then if that can't be negotiated, then there are processes for, issuing a complaint or whatever. Once an accommodation is agreed to between the person with a disability and the person from that office, that letter goes to faculty members with the student's permission, by the way, and they tell the faculty members what are the approved accommodations for that student. We'd like to remind faculty, though, that most students with disabilities do not register with that office for a lot of reasons, personal reasons. It's personal choice, but sometimes it's because they're worried about the stigma, or they're afraid that the faculty member might discriminate against them if they find out, for instance, they have a learning disability. And maybe the faculty members have misconceptions about that. So that's unfortunate, which really promotes this idea of universal design, where faculty at least build in some accessibility within their course, like captions, for example, proactively rather than reactively. So how do students know about this? Well, we publish it on our website in departments, but also the main website. It's probably listed in application forms and so forth. I don't know exactly where that might be, but we do make that known. And in theory, at least K-12 students learn about that through their IEP plans and their Section 504 plans before they graduate from high school, and know they need to find out where that office is or that person is that they need to talk to at an institution they're thinking about attending.
That person said, thank you so much. Any more questions from the audience for our panelists before we wrap up? I think we are okay to wrap up. So thank you all so much for your time and joining this panel. Thank you, audience, for being here. And thank you, TDI, for your sponsorship and sponsoring this conference. Thank you so much. And I'll see you all tomorrow.
Thank you so much for having me.